It's my pleasure now to introduce Philip Clayton, who's going to give this talk and the first one after lunch as well. Philip has been in Cambridge, he's been in Cambridge really for 7 months, although he's been travelling around Europe as well. Although he's from Los Angeles, Claremont, he's the Ingraham Professor at the Claremont School of Theology, and he's also Professor of Philosophy and Religion at Claremont Graduate University. He's managed somehow to get himself nearly 2 years off, so he's been in Cambridge this year and he's going to be in Harvard next year. So it's our good fortune to have him to talk for us today. As you see, he's going to talk about explanation in science and religion, but perhaps I can just make one comment that links with Dennis's previous talk. Dennis introduced the Boyle lectures, which were started 150 years ago, wasn't it? Something like that. Quite a long time ago, whatever it was. But the most recent one was given by Philip Clayton in February this year. So there's a linkage there. So let me hand over to Philip without further ado.
My topic today is explanation, and I want to try to give you some sense of why that's so crucial for the discussion of religion and science. We know, of course, that religious belief has many other functions than explanation. It provides an orientation for believers. It gives them a direction in their lives. It offers ethical and moral guidelines for belief. It may include mythical or legendary elements. Much of religious language is highly symbolic, etc. But one function of religious belief is explanation. That means that when we come to the sciences, we're especially interested to see how they treat explanation and to find out whether there are analogies or disanalogies, unity of theory of explanation in science and religion, or complete dichotomy in what explaining means in the one case and the other. I would like to suggest to you that resolving this question is one of the most urgent primary questions for us to resolve before we move to the concrete questions that are a part of this discipline of science and religion. There's another reason why explanation is particularly crucial, and that has to do with certain claims made on the part of science to be the unique purveyor of knowledge. The claim of science for its uniqueness is often made by means of claims about explanation. Listen to this argument. Step one. Scientific explanations have a unique form. And we'll look in a moment at what people have said in the last 100 years or so about what that form might be. Two, the way that scientific explanations are tested is uniquely powerful. So first is the form, and second is the means of testing. Right? The way they're tested is uniquely powerful. Thirdly, the evidence on behalf of these explanations is unparalleled outside science. Right? We've got three different claims. The conclusion, therefore, science is the sole epistemic authority. That means the sole authority when it comes to questions of knowledge. I would like to suggest to you that when one unravels the superiority claims of science over religion, that they have primarily to do with those three claims about scientific explanations. That's the hypothesis for this talk. If I'm right about that, then it becomes extremely important for those of us who are interested in science-religion connections to examine that argument that I just gave you and to see whether it holds up or not. Let me repeat the argument because it'll be presupposed in everything else that I do. Scientific explanation, so form, number one, form. Scientific explanations have a unique form. Number two, testing. The testing of scientific explanations is uniquely powerful. And thirdly, evidence. The evidence that supports scientific explanatory claims is without equal outside of the sciences. Therefore, science is the sole epistemic authority. The sole authority when it comes to what is knowledge in any field. You see this in a very influential book about almost 10 years ago by E.O. Wilson, the Harvard biologist. The book is called Consilience. And he offers a palm branch to religious persons. Look, we don't need to be at war. I'm offering you conditions of peace. Look at what the conditions are. It's very simple. Everything to do with knowledge is mine, and anything else can be yours. Right? If it has to do with knowledge, it's on my side, and everything else you can have. A sense of beauty, certain, subjective feelings about right and wrong, feelings of balance, aesthetics, and the realm of the emotions. Let religion have that, but don't you dare make a single knowledge claim, because as soon as you do, we're going to beat you, right? And I suggest that that's what underlies the Concilian's claim. If you trace back his argument through the book, you find it has to do with a theory of explanation, and with those 3 points that I've just summarized. So I want to look today at those claims and see how they come across. I've prepared the talk in terms of 10 theses so that you can follow where I am. And so I'll read those just to orient you so you don't get too lost if some of the arguments become too complicated. Am I speaking too quickly for anyone for whom English is not your first language? Can you understand me all right? It's very easy for people who were born with English to speak in such a way that others can't comprehend them, and I think that that's really a shame. 1, in some contexts, the natural sciences use a type of explanation that cannot be duplicated in the social sciences or in theology. Do you see this on your handout? If you don't have that, raise your hand and you can get a copy. This seems to suggest that these scientific explanations are rational in a way that no other type of explanation can be. That's the starting point. And I suppose I want to tell you that I worry about claim number 1. There are some reasons to think it's true, and to the extent that it's true, it does support the sort of claims that E.O. Wilson, Dawkins, and others, Stephen Weinberg, like to make. So I want to tell you that I take that number 1 seriously. This is not a talk that shows that science has no particular claim on knowledge, and therefore it's easy to shove aside its claims to have the strongest explanation and to place religious claims in its place. I actually think that the most powerful, testable, and in some senses rational form of explanation humanity has ever come up with is natural scientific explanation. In some ways it represents the model or the ideal for the explanatory task. And I accept that premise, though at the same time that I'm a religious person who believes in God. How to hold those two claims together is the challenge of today's talk. Let's consider 4 types of religious explanation. Let's begin with the inductive explanation that begins with some sort of temporal data, like spectral data images, looks for correlations or patterns across those data, and then suggests rules of nature. Let's take a simple example. I have noticed that some of the swans I've seen are white. And then I become more rigorous on this highly important question, and I begin realizing that all the swans I've ever seen are white. And now I go out into the countryside hunting for swans. I'm running up to people and saying, where are the swans? Where are the swans? I collect every possible instance I can find of swan sightings. I ask every person I can meet, what about the swans you've seen? What color are they? And the answer always comes back, white. And then I conclude, all swans are white. Can I just get a little deeper into it? And then I'll pause. Shall we say I'll pause at 12:30 and take questions of clarification. But I will finish before 12, and then I'm your property at that point. Okay, so maybe write your questions down in the margins so that you can really dig into the talk. I would enjoy that. So I conclude, therefore all swans are white. For many people outside science, that's taken to be the form of scientific explanation. I think there are major problems with that model, and those of you who know the sciences will recognize how inadequate that is as a sole picture of scientific explanation. Deductive explanation we associate with mathematics or computer simulations with logic or rational thought. That's where we are able to deduce results. I'll show you a model of that in a moment. We should add in probability and statistical forms of explanation alongside them as well. These are 4 types of scientific explanation. Now, what I'd like to do is to introduce you to perhaps the most rigorous theory of scientific explanation from the 20th century. It's the theory of Carl Hempel. The theory is called deductive nomological explanation. And as we go through it, you'll see that only certain natural sciences might possibly meet these standards. All right? Sorry, exponans has jumped over from the right-hand column. We have a series of statements about the conditions that we've observed, and we have a series of general laws. We perform a logical deduction, and we get to the description of the empirical phenomenon. This is called the explanandum, or that thing which is to be explained. And this is called, those first 2 are called the explanans, or what does the explaining. All right? Now, I want you to note a few things about this model. This model suggests that an adequate scientific explanation works with the power of logic. There is a logical relationship, a deductive relationship between the 2 parts. Let me give you an example, a paraphrase of what you see in front of you. These are the conditions that we observe in the lab, and I state them, some set of conditions. Whenever such and such conditions pertain, some observation will follow. Therefore, this observation follows. Right? Whenever I release an object in a vacuum in a gravitational field, that object will fall at a certain rate of acceleration. I release the object in a gravitational field. I observe that object to fall with precisely that acceleration. That's a pretty powerful way of explaining something in the world. If you can make it the result of deductive inference from certain laws and certain antecedent conditions. Let me point out one other feature of this before we move on. The other feature is that explanation and prediction are fully symmetrical. If you have the conditions and the laws, you can predict that this will happen. And if you have the observation that this has happened, you can infer backwards to the antecedent conditions and the law. You see that there's a symmetry, that one can move in both directions. Undeniably, certain parts of natural science meet Hempel's standards, especially in carefully controlled laboratory situations. And when we have an explanation of this sort, we have the most powerful form of explanation that natural science can provide. Unfortunately, that occurs rather rarely. Also, the theory has some rather surprising implications that I don't think one would finally be satisfied with in a theory of explanation. Under the theory I just gave, the framework I just gave, the following is an ideal explanation of the most powerful sort, because it exactly fits this model. John Jones, who is a male, has not become pregnant during the past year because he has faithfully consumed his wife's birth control pills. And here's the law, that's the condition. And any male who regularly takes oral contraceptives will avoid becoming pregnant. That meets the highest standards of explanation. Yet it's an absolutely trivial explanatory claim. There's something about a purely formal theory of explanation which is inadequate. Explanation needs to be more embedded than that. There are other factors that we need to take account of. Let's take a look at those. Please turn to number 2 on your handout. In fact, however, in most cases, scientific explanations cannot be conclusively verified or falsified. Instead, they become parts of empirical research programs, and the community of scientists assesses at a given time whether they seem to be progressing or degenerating. There was a famous debate from 1927 on through the 20th century about the nature of scientific rationality. How many of you are familiar already with the Popper-Kuhn-Feyerabend-Lakatos debate? Is that known? It's known to about a third of you. Let me briefly summarize it because it has everything to do with explanation in science and religion. Karl Popper began the debate with a book called Logik der wissenschaftlichen Forschung, or Logik der Forschung, in 1927, Logic of Scientific Discovery. And he argued that what sets science apart from any other field is not induction, not adding up instances, but falsification. The scientist is out always to disprove her theories. Her goal is to disprove her theories. And therefore, a scientific explanation has to be one which can be falsified. That's the criterion of demarcation between science and non-science. There's something right about that. I talked to William Phillips, Nobel Prize in Physics in 1997, and when they had the method for supercooling so that they could get a matrix of atoms held together in this state, a much larger state of superposition than had been achieved before, they took their data, they got on an airplane, and they flew to their fiercest competitors. They were at NIST. They flew to Colorado. For 3 days, they presented all of their data to their competing group and said, show us where we've made a mistake. There must be something wrong with this. These are unbelievable results. The group in Colorado was unable to falsify the results. They went home disappointed, he said. Though, of course, I mean, he knew that he could probably sniff a Nobel Prize, but he said disappointed, right? Then they flew across the ocean to Paris. He and his top associates brought their data, showed it to the French group who was working on exactly the same question, their next closest competitors, and spent a number of days trying to find a hole in it. Nobody could find a hole in it. And they published it, for which he won the Nobel Prize. That's something about the scientific attitude, to seek to show it to be false. And if it stands up to the most rigorous testing possible, it's right. That was the insight that Karl Popper brought to science. If you want to put it in a model, oops, did I go too? It might sound something like this. If the theory is true, then the prediction is true. The prediction is not true, therefore the theory is not true. Popper says that's the logic of scientific explanation. Let me say it again. If the theory is true, and some prediction follows from the theory, then the prediction must be true. So I go out and look to see whether the prediction's true. Sometimes I find out the prediction is not true. And so by modus tollens, by logical inference, I conclude the scientific theory is not true. I have a case of scientific falsification. He says that's what characterizes science, explanations of that form, right? What happened? Oh, he loved the paradigm cases of science. Copernicus's model better fits the observations than the Ptolemaic model. The observations falsify the notion that the Earth is in the center of the universe. We've ruled out a theory. Newton's laws can handle anomalies that the previous formulations of dynamics couldn't. They are falsified. Newton stands up. Einstein's theory of relativity is more powerful than the previous theories. How? And he loves to cite the example of the Eddington expedition, was it 1919 or 1917? I meant to look. 19, to the coast of Africa for the full solar eclipse, where they measured the location of certain stars and found that they appeared to have moved. Well, of course they hadn't moved. The light had bent going around the gravitational field of the sun. That was a falsification of pre-Einsteinian physics and a verification, it was believed, of Einstein's theory. If you know the history, you know it's massively more complicated than that. But that's the kind of case that Popper, writing merely 10 years, less than 10 years after that expedition, loves to cite. All right? In fact, though, science is massively more complex. And this led Thomas Kuhn in 1962 to publish his book on the structure of scientific revolutions and to introduce the notion of paradigms. A paradigm is a framework that scientists use at a particular time. And they attempt to, let's see if, well, I'll leave it there. They attempt to explain the world from within that paradigm. As time goes on, they collect more and more anomalies, bits of data that won't fit in with the paradigm, until finally, the scientists undergo what Kuhn called a conversion to a new paradigm. The old one is thrown away, a new one is taken on. No falsification occurs. Rather, a large number of little problems are amassed, and those little problems finally add up to a conversion. Kuhn's work was the most purchased book in the philosophy of science in the 20th century, probably the most cited book. It was immensely popular for reasons it would be fun to explore in another context, why it picked up so much in the Britain and America of the 1960s in particular. One has some wonders, but it was considered completely to throw Popper's view out the door. In fact, it led to some even more extreme conclusions. In a book published in 1975, the Berkeley philosopher of science, Paul Feyerabend, suggested that science didn't have any method, any standards of falsification, or any controls whatsoever. That it should be a complete, unrestrained anarchy. He called it epistemic anarchy. And if we let scientists do just anything they want, his rule was anything goes, just what you expect from a Berkeley philosopher in the late 1960s. Anything goes, right? Then science will make the most progress. I've pulled together a few quotations from Kuhn's famous book. It continues this line of movement away from Popper through Kuhn's notion of paradigms and on. Here's the one I mentioned before. From Popper, the theory is true, prediction is not true, the theory is not true. And it was the weaknesses in that view that led to epistemological anarchism. On this view, said Feyerabend, what remains in science are merely aesthetic judgments, judgments of taste, and our own subjective wishes. There's no longer any distinction between science and art. We might as well abolish the honorific connotations attached to the word science. Science becomes, quote, an attractive and yielding courtesan, and should be acknowledged and treated as such. More specifically, Feyerabend calls for epistemological anarchism in science, position that anything goes. Listen to this. He proclaimed himself a Dadaist and points out some of the consequences of no longer accepting any distinction between science and non-science. We should now view the Bible as an alternate cosmology of the same standing as any scientific cosmology. Voodoo can enrich our physiology. Acupuncture may be preferable to modern medicine as a whole. We should break our methodological rules whenever possible, as Galileo did. And finding a satisfactory theory depends, for instance, on having a satisfactory sex life. Also Berkeley in the 1960s, I think, right? There you see the sort of extreme movement away from Popper. All right, our time is short, so there would be lots of nuances we could talk about this movement. But I'd like to suggest as a thesis that the work of one of Popper's students at the London School of Economics, Imre Lakatos, found a balance between the two. I would like to recommend this to you as an understanding of scientific rationality, and then apply that to the question of explanation and to the question of religious beliefs in particular. That's my goal then for the remainder of this talk, all right? Any questions of clarification so far? Things that you need to push me on or get clear on before I move on? Excellent, good. For Lakatos, the starting point is the idea of a research program. Scientists are engaged in formulating and participating in research programs of research. It's not an individual theory that gets tested. It's not an entire paradigm or worldview that gets tested. It's a particular specified program of research that scientists work within. Some of the key terms of his notion are the following four. Every research program has a hard core. It has some guess about the world that underlies that set of work, right? And we might speak of these in very broad terms, like Darwin's guess about random variation and selective retention as the motor of evolution, or the premise of epigenetic factors in explaining cell mechanisms, say in recent cell systems biology, or string theory, in some specifiable hardcore. But that's not all that a research program consists of, because around that core claim is built an entire network of auxiliary hypotheses. Hypotheses created by the scientists as they try to develop their core idea to make it testable, to extend it to new sorts of data, and so forth. There's a positive heuristic, which is what the scientists think within the program is the way to make progress. And lastly, the community within that scientific discipline can make assessments at any given time whether a particular research program is progressing or degenerating. Let's take string theory, since I just mentioned it. I would say that in the 1985 conference, and with the suggestion of M theory, the scientific community saw their important developments. There was an excitement about it. A huge number of doctoral students in physics did, and still do, actually, go into areas relating to the mathematics of string theory or M theory. At the same time, now let's move to a conference in physics in February 2002. 200 physicists from around the world sat in a conference room. There was a presentation on string theory by Malcedeno, I think, from Harvard. And then I listened to the discussion for an hour. And what implicitly I could hear was the sense that this was a research program that was degenerating. It hadn't provided empirical advances. It was not clear how it could provide empirical advances. It was rich for developing new mathematics, but not rich for the empirical questions of physics. That was an assessment, not shared by everybody in the room. But if you'd been sitting in the room, I think you would have had the sense there is skepticism whether this is still a progressing research program. Lakatar says, that's the way we assess science. The scientists in the field will sort of, rub their chins and say, it's not going very well right now. Is it irrational for anyone to work in this area? No. Should all the funding in fundamental physics go to string theory today? I don't think so. Do you see how it goes? I mean, they're just sort of subtle decisions that one hears. And whether it's immunology or whichever area you're talking about, the people in the field will tend to feel certain research programs are shooting forward and deserve all the attention they can get. You'll send your doctoral students in that area. Other ones are not going so well right now. Have they been conclusively falsified? No. Well, what would that mean in science? Right. But do they deserve quite as much funding, or should they sort of be set on the side for a few specialists to work on? Yeah. Do you understand? That's the picture of scientific rationality that emerges from Lakatos. I find it very powerful, both in the history of science and today as a way of explaining scientific practice. It understands science to be something like a web. There's a hard core in the center that defines an area of work. A number of auxiliary hypotheses that help us extend that theory to what we can actually measure. We're always making changes around the edges of the web as we gather new data, refining, extending, adding new auxiliary hypotheses. It's not that at some point the scientific community just has a religious conversion, throws away this web and buys into a new one. That's not true. But it's also not true that a given web gets falsified so that you're required to throw it away and never come back to it. It's rather that the community has a rough assessment at any given time how it's going with these various webs, how the research programs are doing in terms of empirical fruitfulness, theoretical fruitfulness, etc. Now, if the analogy with scientific explanation is going to be preserved, in religion, there are certain requirements that have to be taken into account. Because, ladies and gentlemen, why couldn't we view religious beliefs as research programs? I'll talk in a moment about the disanalogies, but let me just suggest the analogy. What if a given set of religious beliefs functions as let's call it a program for living, a set of beliefs about the world that individuals believe can help make life meaningful, can help make sense of life, not in the sense of a fiction, but in the sense of an overall world and life view by which one can live. What if one wanted to say that the explanations, that these sets of beliefs functions as explanations that guide the living, not just the minds, but also the lives of individuals within that religious tradition? In other words, what if we tried to take Lakatosh's view of science as a model for telling people how the religious life might be rational? That's the hypothesis I want to explore with you. And if you attack me, that's where you should really probe, because I think there's something to that analogy. And for the remaining 15 minutes, I'm going to focus just on that final analogy. All right? Now, it will have some entailments which not all persons will want to accept. So for some of you, you have to say, well, if that's what it means to treat a set of religious beliefs as a research program or program for living, I don't want it. It's too costly. But others will find that form of connection with science interesting or intriguing. Let's see. It seems to me that these requirements would follow. The religious proposals must be open to intersubjective examination and criticism. So I have a practice as a believer in God, a religious practice that I engage in, but I also meet with philosophers, say the Cambridge D Society, and I present my beliefs in God, or how I think that God can be compatible with evil in the world. And when I put forward a proposal in that context, I have to be willing to listen to their criticisms, and sometimes to withdraw certain suggestions I've made that haven't stood up. Second, no in-principle limits can be set on who can participate in this examination, even though some may better qualify as experts than others. No solution that I offered in this debate can be grounded by privileged premises. So somebody asked me when I gave the paper on the problem of evil, well, how is it possible that God could act in the world in this way? I could have said, I've experienced it, and you haven't. So you have no right to ask any questions about what I'm saying here. I have privileged knowledge. This is how God does it, because I personally have experienced that. Now, in the context of my religious practice, we might talk like that. But in the context of this open debate, that's not a way of arguing that's acceptable. At that point, I pull myself out of the debate, right, into the privacy of my particular religious tradition or experience. Fourth, hence, all rational beliefs must ultimately be treated as hypotheses. To the extent that I want to say that religious beliefs may function as an explanation, as a research program, in that context, that more philosophical context, I have to treat them as hypothetical. We'll want to talk about the implications of that when we get to the discussion. Can we go ahead and jump to point number 6? Now let's start. Sorry, let's do number 4 first. Inference to the best explanation. Scientific explanation is a comparative endeavor. One does not need to prove an explanatory hypothesis in science, but only to show that it provides a better explanation of the existing data than do its major competitors. I think this framework, IBE it's called, Inference to the Best Explanation, is a very powerful way to understand how scientific explanation works. The trouble with Popper and Carl Hempel is that their notion of explanation is absolutely independent of the context. It doesn't matter what the other possible explanations are. You just look at the logic of one particular explanation. But I think science doesn't actually work that way, and we know that religion doesn't. Van Frossen formulated a beautiful critique, let's skip over this, of that in his work on the pragmatics of explanation. Bas van Frossen raises this question. Take the sentence, the question, why did Adam eat, not heat, eat the apple? It shows how hot it was when I wrote this talk. But that one question, or that request for an explanation, may ask at least three different questions. Why Adam? Why did Adam eat the apple? Why did Adam eat the apple rather than throwing it at Eve? Or why an apple? Why didn't Adam eat a strawberry or something? In any yeah, exactly. In any given case, says Van Frossen, I think this is exactly right. We ask why P, that is, we ask for an explanation, why P, in contrast to other members of a given set of options, even though those that broader set of options is often left implicit. That's exactly right. I think in science one can show there's always a pragmatic context. Why do you endorse this particular theory of the origin of life and not a different theory? Well, what are the options that are out there right now? Let's say that the community, we can find in the literature 5 major options on the origin of life. I side with option 3 against the others because I think they have certain weaknesses and that option 3 does a better job than its other competitors. Look at what that does for religious questions. Rather than making religious believers meet some a priori set of standards in order to advance their beliefs, it says this. Here's what it says. I hold certain religious beliefs as better explaining human existence as a whole because I think they do a better job of explaining human existence than the competitors. Take an example. I'm a theist. I believe that a God exists. I think theism does a better job of explaining human existence as a whole than naturalism, the belief that all that exists are natural forces and particles. I can't prove to you theism a priori. I can't put up an overhead slide that can take any rational individual and force her to accept theism is true. But I can say when we look at this balance, theism or pure naturalism, I think theism has a more powerful explanation of human existence as a whole. Our moral experience, our aesthetic experience, our quest for meaning, our desire for immortality, those sorts of factors. IBE, this framework, allows us to make comparative judgments. And I think that's crucial for our understanding of how religious explanations work. Let's jump to number 6. The difference between the natural and the social sciences, specifically between how explanations are formulated and tested in the two fields, can be argued in at least 3 different ways, based on the phenomenon of meaning, based on epistemological differences, and in terms of rational decision theory. I guess I better add number 5 to that. Various arguments suggest that explanations in the social sciences are importantly different from explanations in the natural sciences. This is of crucial importance for our understanding of the status of theological explanations. I want to spend a few minutes covering that topic because it's often omitted in talks about religious explanation. It's often treated as if the entire discussion were scientific explanations and how they work on the one hand, and religious explanations on the other hand. I'd like to suggest to you that in between those two is a mediating area, the way in which we explain human behavior. The only way to understand how religious explanations work is, after we've looked at the natural sciences, to look at the way in which we explain human behavior psychologically, sociologically, and in cultural anthropology. And if we understand how human behavior needs to be explained, what makes a strong, a powerful explanation of human behavior, then we can understand how religious beliefs can function as explanations. Look at these contrasts. In the natural sciences, it's often metaphysical questions that are raised by physical theories that lead to theological discussions. Right? Why are there the laws of nature? What's the status of a law of nature? There's a metaphysical question raised by work in physics that then might lead as a transition to a theological question. Why is there a uniformity of nature? What preceded the Big Bang? I mean, there's clearly non-scientific questions which often are the transitions to the religious question and to what a religious person might offer as an explanation, right? Why is it that evolution has produced highly intelligent beings? How do we account for the appearance of purpose in the natural world, right? Well, that's a metaphysical question that's not a part of the practice of biology, but it makes a transition to what many religious persons want to say. By contrast, in the human sciences, it's usually the meaning question that leads to theological and religious issues. When we speak of metaphysics in the social sciences, it usually involves the values that pertain to agents. Do you see what a sharp contrast there is between those two modes of explaining? If you leave out the meaning question, I think you can't understand all the ways in which religious beliefs function. I'll just leave that up for a moment. We don't have time to go through it. But you can see the vastly different sorts of questions that arise in the two cases. The natural sciences and the religion science debate in those fields tends to be preoccupied with a certain set of questions. But if we look at religion and the social sciences, we get a very different sort of questions, urgent matters to resolve. And one could be completely successful over here in addressing these sorts of questions. I'm not sure that we are yet, but one could be, without really making much progress on these questions, and vice versa. Too often when you see talk of explanation in science and religion, you think of physics and some set of religious beliefs. But it's not that easy. Without the mediation, I think we can't make the progress. So I'd like to suggest when we think about explanations, we think about a triad. Not just a direct move from physics to, say, religion, but we think of three areas of interest. And if we numbered the three sides of that triangle there, then each one of them has its particular focus, its particular set of interests, its particular emphases. It's after explaining a different type of question or answering a different sort of problem. If you think about that for a moment, you realize it adds a complexity to the religion science discussion, but also an interest and I think a depth that's often missing. I have to say, as a religious person, when I read some of the debates about the nature of natural law, well, I think they're philosophically very interesting, but often I feel that my religious side of my being is not really spoken to. There's something, a reason why religion is important for me that isn't captured by some of those very abstract debates. But when somebody talks about the quest to make life meaningful, when somebody talks about the fear of anomie or lawlessness, the sense that we live in a chaotic universe where there's nothing predictable, and the way in which religion functions to offer an explanation for that world, then as a religious believer, I nod my head and say, yes, that's a part of the religious life that I experience and that the people around me experience in my religious tradition. So I think adding that other side of the triangle is extremely important. And when you think about explanation, you need to mediate it through those sorts of questions. One last slide. What happens when we look at explanation in the social sciences, we find a movement up a sort of hierarchy from some very basic questions of human beings in the world to broader and broader questions. And you'll find many of the social sciences located more in this lower level, but it seems to me that they extend on up to questions which demand religious explanation. Let me say that differently. Down here we have purely social scientific explanations. powerful, testable explanations of human behavior. As you move up, you make the transition. It seems to be inevitably, with no break, to religious explanations. There's a gradual expansion of the explanatory task as we move from these more specific questions on up. I mean, obviously, in the social sciences, we'll begin with humans living their lives. How is it that we actually live? Psychological theories address humans living their lives. That is, we construct questionnaires to see how people respond on various factors. We do factor analysis to find which factors are significantly correlated, and then we attempt to construct psychological theories that might explain those significant correlations. Add on to that social psychological dimension, the way in which the individual's interpretation of herself is fit into her particular social contexts. Move up from that to the more general study of the social world, sociology and cultural anthropology. Now we have broader theories, like the theories of Mead or Parsons, which are beyond the stricter correlational work of empirical social psychology. Then there's something that Quentin Skinner dubbed grand theory in the social and human sciences. There we begin to ask, what's the nature of being in the world, by drawing from social studies. This is still an explanatory task, but you see how the level, the breadth of the explanations is increasing as we move up? I just want to suggest that to understand the way in which religious explanations function, you have to follow these various steps upward. When somebody says, I'm a religious person and belief in God helps for me to explain my existence, we can't make sense of that claim until we understand the way in which it grows out of a very natural set of tasks in the social sciences. Grand theory, then philosophical anthropology. What is the nature of the human person? Religious studies attempts to study the ways in which religions help to make the universe meaningful. Religious studies obviously is involved in offering explanations of religious behavior. And then finally, theology, that is thought from within a given religious tradition on the place of humans in the universe as the creation of God, or as the result of samsara, of illusion, or through codependent origination, whichever framework that one uses. I mean, it could be a Buddhist theological framework where there's no God as an individually existing being. But we offer the broadest sort of explanation of human existence as a whole. Okay, I think what I want to do is to move through very briefly the final few theses and then see if I can, in about 3 minutes, open it up to discussion. There's much more to cover, but I'm more interested in seeing what interests you, where you're pleased or uncomfortable with these claims. And I think that'll be more fruitful for us in the long run. 7, religious research programs are not exactly analogous to scientific research programs. There are important differences in source, in motivation, and in testability. And I would have talked for half an hour about the contrasts between the ways in which religious explanations function for believers and the way in which scientific explanations function within science. The motivation that brings me to religion is not the same as the motivation that brings a person to the lab, in most cases. Actually, I've talked to some Hindu scientists, however, who say that they see a very close connection between their motivation as scientists and their motivation as spiritual persons. But for many, there are disanalogies. Where the beliefs stem from and how they're tested vary radically, in many cases, between the sciences and religion. 8. It's an essential requirement of traditional religious practice that at least some of the beliefs of that religion be true. Imagine saying, well, yes, I have a religious practice, I devote myself to this religious worldview, and I think that everything they believe is false. That would at least be strange, wouldn't it? We tend to think that at least some of the beliefs of our tradition are true. But what I want to say in number 8 is that that's not all that religious practice involves. It also involves what we might call a self-conception, a view of who I am. And that view of who I am is not a series of scientific or objective statements. It's not an explanation. It's a fundamental, Heidegger would say, a fundamental mode of being in the world. And that's a part of my religious life. And that is not a matter of explaining. It's a very immediate, intuitive response to the world, an often unthematized conception of myself that guides me in my religious practice and life. That's not necessarily a part or relevant to scientific explanation. Judaism, for example, involves an image of the sort of persons Jews are supposed to become. And that image is taken to be normative for Jewish believers. Or, if you read the rabbis, one of many, many possible images. Not all the beliefs in a religious self-conception need to be deduced directly from statements known to be true. Not all the beliefs serve as explanations. Okay. And here's 9. I wrote this right at the end so that you'd have a sense of what's hard about this analogy that I'm exploring. As intriguing as I find it, I want to close by saying it's costly. It brings with it certain costs. And I want them to be in black and white so that you can push me on them. 9. If, and I italicize the if, nothing in this talk has said you need to treat religious explanations as analogous to scientific explanations. In fact, many religious believers do, but a religious believer is not required to. Soren Kierkegaard says religion is about the infinite passion of inwardness and has nothing to do with objective belief or explanation at all. And that is a viable interpretation of religion. Thus the italics. If you wish to treat religious explanations as even analogous to scientific explanations, certain requirements follow. One's not required to derive religious explanations from empirical data alone, or to show that they can be conclusively falsified. But one does need to show how they represent an inference to the best explanation, given some specific explanatory question. And it's that clause that we need to talk about. There's a universe of reflection that lies in those 5 words. Also, if one wants to claim any analogy with scientific explanations, one has to hold one's explanatory hypotheses open to feedback from a broader community of those who are reflecting on these sorts of questions. So 10, in discussing theological explanations, one must acknowledge both continuities and important discontinuities. 3 morals in conclusion, and with this I end. 1, this approach suggests a continued need for feedback from a broader community of inquirers. I think in today's world there's a big danger of isolationism, that religious communities will isolate themselves from each other, from the scientific community and from philosophical communities. And part of what's exciting about religion and science is it moves beyond that isolation. I do not believe in the identification of science and religion. I do not think they're the same thing. But as a religious believer, I want to be open to and continually in dialogue with the very best of science internationally. I want to be open to and continually in dialogue with religious believers from all the traditions. Keith Ward is not speaking this week, but he said at a meeting of the International Society of Science and Religion in Cambridge a few weeks ago, I think of myself as a Vedantic Christian. I'm deeply drawn to Advaita Vedanta, and I'm a Christian. And I think those sorts of connections bring a richness to religious identity. Vedanta, a Vedantan Christian. Second, so that's the dangers of isolationism. Second, I suggest the need for mediators. The need for mediators. We make our discipline too superficial if we attempt to draw direct lines from some scientific theory to some set of religious beliefs. Right? As a theist, I deeply believe that God guides the history of the world. But the reason I don't associate myself with the view called intelligent design, and by that I mean very specifically the work of Behe and Dembski, is that there is not the mediation between scientific questions and religious beliefs. I may share religious beliefs with them, but I want there to be the mediation, does justice to the actual complexity of the questions. The mediation may be philosophical, it may be metaphysical, and it may be social scientific, namely the question of human meaning in the world. But usually some sort of mediation is necessary to have very real and rigorous connections between scientific statements and religious statements. Lastly, the feedback goes both ways. I believe that, this is a strong statement, I believe that as a religious person, I believe that religious persons have a truer understanding of the nature of the world than naturalism offers. I thus believe that my religious view offers an enhanced, and I say this with humility but out of conviction, a truer understanding of the nature of the natural world, the ultimate nature of the natural world. That's a movement from my religious context to my interpretation of science. If I want that arrow, I have to accept this arrow. There are implications of science for what I, as a Christian, believe. And I have to take very seriously those implications, whether it's historical critical research or cutting-edge biology or new cosmological models. I find that difficult, that as a believer who wants to stake his life on a set of beliefs, I need to be always listening to the best results of humans in the sciences. But I believe that arrow of feedback complements and supplements the other arrow. And that as a believer who wishes to take science seriously, I have to live in the openness to change that entails. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip. Well, that leaves plenty of time for questions.
I wanted to pick up immediately on your feedback from the broader community.
Yeah.
I want to argue that I think the question you start, or not the question, the title you start with is elitist.
Elitist?
Elitist. And
Oh,
I'll explain
dear.
why.
The ultimate.
You use three words: explanation, science, and religion. Now, I want to argue to you what you should be using is the words working, engineering, and spiritual well-being. Now, I come from a standpoint of an engineer,
Mm-hmm.
therefore I can look at scientists, and all the time what I see is elitism. I look at religious people who are trying to explain things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The average person in the pew, the average person out there in the street is not seeking explanation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What that person is seeking is, does it work? The politicians who succeed in life are not those who go to explain things, they are those who go to make things work.
Mm.
Now, we have to learn from our culture.
Mm.
So it seems to me, and as an engineer, we seek to make things work. It's always interesting to me that when people look at this question, which I argue is an elitist question, of the issue between religion and science, they're almost taking out of the community and going into their little huddle.
Mm.
That's not where people are.
Mm.
So I think you should come at it more from the position, because in engineering, why in my life as a researcher over 40 years have I at times had to say to my PhD research students, without any real evidence, look, you're hitting your head against a brick wall. And
Good.
that must mean there's something in me and my feelings. We put this magic word experience, but I couldn't prove anything to you.
Mm.
I get a feeling, a
Okay.
kind of, I'm trying to interact with
Right,
all these
right.
different laws. Now, obviously, we depend on science.
Okay.
for
Okay,
that.
let me see what I can do with
But
it.
you see what I'm
Yeah,
getting
let
at?
me try.
Where I'm coming from.
I think it's a good corrective, right? There is actually a bloke, I've forgotten his name right now, who has a book, something like The Joy of Engineering, and he approaches the religion science discussion from that perspective. There are also two chaplains at the University of Delft in Holland who work at Delft as a primary engineering school and who take an engineering approach. There is something right about that. I mean, the believer is often trying to tinker things together, to make things work in a situation of constant tension. Things are always breaking, he's trying to, as we say, cobble things together to sort of make it through as a religious believer. That's right. I also remember a wonderful moment when we were having this abstract discussion of religion and science in the Science and Spiritual Quest group with leading computer scientists and information technology people from around the world. That is primary engineering training. And we're often, well, God is, and science is, and physics is, and so forth. And then the next presentation came. This was early days of PowerPoint, and the projector wouldn't work right. We had in the room, people with $1 million a year incomes, right? People with, the person who wrote HTML and so forth, sitting in the room, and fantastic. And they had a great joy of, everyone dropped the broad questions and went out, and somebody ran down to the local store and bought bits of wire, and somebody else found some electrical tape, and they hockeyed together this projection, and everyone sort of showed that was what they loved to do, to make the thing go. It was a wonderful side on your side. The one thing makes me nervous. If you tell me, as many atheists do, look, Clayton, your religious beliefs may work for you, but many things that are false work for you. There's a superstition that you never walk under a ladder, but always around it. You never go under it. Well, that may work for people, or you never step on a crack, or you might have bad luck. Superstition works for people. The only trouble is it's false. And often that is an elitist critique of my own religious belief. The elitist scientist will say, E.O. Wilson will say, great, your beliefs work for you, wonderful. They're not knowledge, they're all false, or at least they're not known. Science has all areas of knowledge. So fine, you can live by false beliefs. And that, I think, we have to fight. As a religious believer, I have to fight that. The only way to fight it is to try to show there's some way in which my beliefs might be true. Some way in which they can function as rational explanations of the world. And if I'm to do that, I have to take on these elitist questions.
There's another question. Sorry, yes.
This is going in a somewhat different direction. I would like to give an historical example of an attempt of testing a religious belief through scientific investigation, the conquest of Mexico. The Aztecs had, it is more than a legend, it is a fundamental belief that their predecessors, the Toltecs, had made something very nasty. They had chastened away their best king, their last king, Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent. He wore this title because he was at the same time the priest of the god plumed serpent. And when there was a risk, a statistical risk, which was maximum every 52 years.
You have to make it very short. 1 minute question so that we can get in debate. Can you make it a very short example? So I can, because I don't yet, if it's too much detail, I won't be able to answer it from the standpoint of the talk.
Okay. It is quite long to make the comparisons, but they tried in a practical manner to test if it was really Quetzalcoatl who was coming back on that date, on that place, in that suit, with these vessels, with these weapons, with a lot of characteristics of Quetzalcoatl. Was it really Quetzalcoatl or somebody else? They gave him and the Spaniards a meal of the best pieces they had, human flesh. And that was the last test. Quetzalcoatl hated the human sacrifices, and Cortés refused to eat that. So he was really Quetzalcoatl.
Ah, okay. Excellent example. That one makes us sweat. Let's generalize it to a type of example, right? It is on topic, isn't it? I want to know whether religious explanations are true. She suggests that sometimes, perhaps, they can be directly tested and verified or falsified in a manner which is very, very close to a scientific test. Yes? And that sometimes we find verification of religious beliefs. May I introduce a parallel example drawn from a recent book by a leading figure in science and religion, Nancy Murphy. In 1990, she said, we should test and see what the Holy Spirit wants. She said, here's my proposal. She actually used Lakatosh, so she used the same figure I use today to say that this was a way of testing religious explanations scientifically. We want to know whether the Holy Spirit wants to be called he or she. What does the Holy Spirit prefer? Which pronoun does the Holy Spirit prefer, she said. Well, we've got to find out. So we're going to take a church group, and we are going to pray to the Holy Spirit using the word she. And if things go well, not for Nancy Murphy now, be careful. Right. Well, I'll get to my worries about this in a moment. You're seeing some skepticism steeping through here. But so we'll pray using she, and if things go very well in our religious group, and there's much life, and there's power of the Holy Spirit is manifested, and signs of the Holy Spirit are present, then we will infer scientifically that the Holy Spirit really does want to be called she, and conversely if it doesn't happen. I have a similar problem with both examples. It may be that we can construct tests like that, but it seems to me that our degree of uncertainty is very high, and our level of confidence should be rather low. Why might that be? And can I go back to the main point, the need for mediation? I believe certain religious beliefs are true. I take science with utter seriousness. But to fit the two together is more than constructing a logical argument. If A, then B, A, therefore B. Or if A, then B, not B, therefore A. That's too simplistic for this relationship. I would hope, and I'm certain, knowing this course, you would go away from this week, if with anything, feeling that the relationships between science and religion are immensely more complex than that sort of direct testing relationship. And if I were giving the final examination, which I'm not, I would ask you to write on the question, why are direct connections between science and religion of these two sorts not adequate? Explain some of the reasons why it's more complex, some of the things that mediate between them. And that's the core of my talk today.
We're over here first. There's a long sequence of people.
Sorry, then I'll be briefer. I'll ask you to be brief, and I'll be brief, and that way we'll get everyone. Sorry. Just yell at me, that's all right. Thank you.
You didn't actually mention the use of, shall we say, sacred text in explanation of
Excellent
religion.
question. Excellent.
Revelation.
In science, we don't have such sacred texts and rule books. When we come across theories and disprove them, then it goes out of the window.
Right.
A lot of problems I have in reconciling science and religion, in debate anyway, are with, I just get thrown back at me quotations, and well, the speaker believes thoroughly and absolutely in these quotations, and we don't get anywhere. So perhaps you could say something
Brilliant
about
question.
how you can see a way forward on this
brilliant
to
question.
bend the rule books if necessary.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Excellent question. Thank you. You began by pointing out a disanalogy. We would never, when criticize while giving a scientific paper, we would say, well, our authoritative text, chapter 25:4, says as follows, therefore I'm right. I mean, that's absurd. That would never happen in science, right? So I grant the disanalogy. There won't be an identity of the two. Can we make the difference less extreme? I'll tell you what my position suggests. Step one. Explanation does not require one to derive the explanation from some prior set of premises which themselves have been tested. Put differently, the source of a scientific explanation is not what makes for its rationality. Rather, the testing and the spirit of openness with which it is held makes for scientific rationality. Right? That suggests that just as a scientist may come to her theory with the greatest amount of conviction, with 20 years of working on it, with tight emotional connection, because after all, her advisor had held the same theory, her best friends work on the same theory, her subjective attachment to a given theory may be extremely high, yet she has the discipline to walk into the lab and to attempt to subject it to the strongest possible testing. I would like to suggest a model of the religious life. For some of you, this will be heretical, but I advance it, where I can come informed by Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, with trying to orient my life around those sources. And yet when I enter into a dialogue with you on whether evil is consistent with the God I believe in, suffering in the world is consistent with the God I believe in, to be able to stand back from those texts and to attempt to engage with you in arguments to make the best case I can for my explanations. Bottom line, subjective conviction does not rule out openness to critical feedback. Second premise, I never appeal to my level of subjective conviction as reasons that we ought to believe this belief is true. If religious person argued in that fashion, you wouldn't have the same frustration, I think.
Can I just pick you up on this before
Please,
I let you go?
I could tell that was coming.
Yep. I mean, when a scientist stands up and gives a talk, he does have sacred texts that he's working from. If he gives a talk which is completely ignoring all the paradigms of the understood grand theories of the time, he or she will just get shot down from the audience. However innovative their new ideas are, they say, but, you know, that contravenes Newton's law of gravity. That can't be right because that contravenes that. So there are sacred texts. You just don't keep talking about Newton's law of gravity because it's underpinning everything, for example. So can you just amplify that a bit, because you do come with those texts, even though it's not, it's not John 3:16 or whatever.
Yeah, right. And of course, the disanalogy lies in the fact that we wouldn't speak of them in science as sacred texts. The analogy is the following. There's no scientific testing without beginning with the body of established fact and the dominant theories. You never began the scientific talk in any field by saying, all right, today I offer you a new view of reality. In fact, I get 100 emails a day, and the 20 that I toss are the ones that tell me at the beginning, I've just discovered the nature of ultimate reality. No one else has ever seen it before, and if you'll just buy my book or visit my website, you'll know. Do you get those emails? I presume, right? They're sort of circulated like spam around the world, the ultimate view of reality. Right. So the scientist, part of the strength of scientific debate is always to have the platform of what we've achieved. Ladies and gentlemen, it makes science conservative. Science is conservative in some ways because you would take a lot to throw out Newton's laws, at least as limit cases for the accurate theory, right? But the scientist beginning there is then open to see whether we need to modify. Perhaps a little line right at the outset, perhaps deep, deep changes heading toward the heart of science, as in special and general relativity, for example. Likewise in religion, I would like to say that I can begin with a web of beliefs and practices, my scriptures, my theological traditions, and that then I can engage in changes which may be deep and far-reaching.
We'll go 1, 2, 3 in that order. We may.
Can I take up your analogy of string theory? Supposing Ed Witten is like Copernicus, and
Sometimes he talks like that.
Right. And in his analysis of M theory in 1996, he proposed 11 dimensions. Now, those extra dimensions may be all around us and within us. If that's so, then our 3 dimensions is only a part of a deeper reality. And if that's so, it fits in with theological explanations and even the practical, not deduced but encountered. Now, Copernicus had to wait 150 years. There's only 10 years since 1996. Would it be fair to just dismiss string theory and just leave it for a few people?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question for the entire talk, because what it allows us to clarify are a number of the key things I've tried to get across. Let me just mention 4 or 5, right? That we could derive from that from the example, right? First, we want to ask Well, first, with Lakatos, we would say string theory has not been falsified. It may not have led to empirical advances, but it's still there, receiving an immense amount of attention, and may be true. So it may not be producing new empirical knowledge and developments within actual theoretical physics, but it's something that is very much on our awareness. It won't go away for a long time. Second, one wants to ask Witten, but is it science? Does it meet the requirements for progressive views in physics? Third, if it's not science, it may still be immensely important and intriguing as metaphysics. And in fact, there's not such a sharp line sometimes, is there, between theoretical cosmology, for example, and metaphysics. I mean, look at the multiverse debate. Look at the anthropic principle. In many, many areas we find haziness. It doesn't mean that metaphysics and physics are the same thing, but there's a way in which one extends toward the other. And fourthly and finally, if it is metaphysics, it may still be valuable as an explanatory framework for broader goals than explaining quantum theory or deriving quantum gravity or something like that.
So we might all be new flatlanders.
We might. But I don't have reason as a scientist yet to throw out its competitors. I have reason to keep that in my awareness. But as a religious person, as a broader person who asks more broadly spectacle questions, I have more reason to take higher dimensionalities seriously after, well, it was before 1996, but certainly after 1996 than I did before. And I would concede the point.
Thank you, David.
Someone's going to get looped around there.
I share your sentiment on the importance of true beliefs. Therefore, I think it is important to ask the question whether the theory, the account of theory choice or account of scientific explanations that we have gives us a reason to believe that our scientific theories are mostly, at least approximately true. So, do you think that because you favor the Lakatos account of theory choice, do you think that this account gives us a reason to think that most of our scientific theories are at least approximately true? Because I think the problem with Popper and Kuhn's accounts of theory choice is that these two accounts don't give us reason to think that our theories are approximately true.
Yeah.
For example, Popper's theory, it is true that if the predictions is not true, then the theory is not true. But it doesn't follow that if the prediction is true, then the theory is true. So
very nice. Yeah.
Can I just ask if everybody could hear that?
I'll
Yes.
restate the question.
Yes, that'd be good. Move across.
Yeah. That is a huge question. I'm glad because we haven't spoken of the relationship between our best explanations at a given time in some field and truth. You're exactly right. Popper had to admit that his theory didn't give us reasons to say that scientific theories were true. He coined a new word, verisimilitude, or truth-likeness, verisimilitude, to describe the status of theories proposed but not yet falsified. He had to admit that if my theory, T, survives 27 falsification attempts, that doesn't make it more likely to be true. It just means that it's failed to be false in 27 ways, right? So then we ask, so what about science as a whole, right? Could the whole thing be false? The web, those our most sacred texts in a given scientific discipline, could they be false? Yes. We've no proof. Could there be some scientific revolution where they just were all thrown away in the future? Yeah, definitely. Right. So what's the rational thing to do? Would it then be rational for the religious person to argue as follows? Well, all scientific theories might be false. I have a religious theory that I'm deeply invested in. I believe in the coming of Messiah. I'm an Orthodox Jew, and I'm awaiting the coming of Messiah. Therefore, it's more rational for me to to junk, to throw away all of science, and to take mine as the best attested, the most rational view of the universe. I say that's false. That despite the uncertainty of science, it still represents the most rigorous way we have of testing the world. So in the sphere of explanation of the natural world, science is the game to beat. Its possible falseness does not show that we can just throw it all out. That's, you can find that the error in Darwin on Trial by Philip Johnson, right? Is that his name? The sense that, well, because science might be false and sometimes is, science often changes its mind, it's on an exact equal level with religious explanations of the natural world. That doesn't follow. Now, let's take the category of the ultimate nature of reality. Science doesn't speak to metaphysical questions of such. There, the game is much more open. So it would seem to me, it would seem to me there, yeah, well, I was going to take that off the record, Dennis. It would seem to me there, in the metaphysical questions, that a science-based naturalism and, say, theism stand on at least equal footing. Bottom line answer, it depends on the sphere of debate. The specialists on the question of the origin of life, that is, the causal mechanisms in which living cells arose from biochemical compounds, those are biochemists, cell biologists, and so forth. They're the specialists in that area. So it's rational for me to be informed by their results, even though they might be wrong. The specialists in the understanding of primate behavior are primatologists. It's rational for me to turn to them. The specialists in the understanding of social psychological behaviors are social psychologists, right? But if the question is the ultimate meaning of the universe, whether all things arise from codependent origination, then my community are people who ask those broad questions. And now science doesn't control.
So does it mean that we have reason to think that science is rational, but we don't have reason to think that science is at least approximately true?
It is rational for us to follow the results of the sciences if we're looking for the best available explanation. I can put it more radically. IBE, inference to the best explanation, is the only access we have to truth in natural explanations. All I can say is this explanation seems to be better than its competitors. And yet I have to say it might be false. This is radical, but let me say it nonetheless, but turn off the tape recorder, all right? No. Could it be that I could say the same thing as a religious person? I accept theism, which appears to me to be, a belief in God appears to me to be the best explanation of existence as a whole, but I don't know that it's true. Given a set of competitors that I'm aware of, it seems to have these strengths, but it doesn't follow that I know it's true. Could I live a religious life with that, making that statement of humility? That follows from my talk. You should think if that's a consequence you're willing to accept.
When you talk about explanation, do you mean the explanation to the satisfaction of all? The reason I ask, where do I come from? I come from a fertilized zygote. That could be satisfactory to Richard Dawkins or Daniel Dennett, but which may not be satisfactory to me. So it's perfectly possible that we could have a set of explanations which may be applicable to a group of people and not to other group of people. And in that way, it is kind of the continuum or the panorama of explanations, because I don't think that we could have any explanation to the satisfaction of all. I mean, that's kind of, my personal thinking. And secondly is that falsification of any phenomena. There are something which cannot be proved, not disproved.
Right.
Religion is realization. If I say that, I had a vision of Jesus Christ last night, there is no way, no action potential or neuroscience technique can prove or disprove. I had a vision of Jesus Christ last night. And that's the problem. I mean, seriously, this problem arose in the mystic vision
Yes,
because
yes, I understand.
that
Yeah.
cannot be falsified.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. On the second question, I concede. The point of the talk is it's also true in science that there are certain beliefs that can't be conclusively falsified, yet science is still rational. So it's not fair to say it's only religion that where falsification is impossible. In much of science, strict falsification is impossible as well. Okay, on the first question, private explanations. Yes, there are explanations which are extremely satisfying to the individual and not satisfying to the broader community. There are explanations that are satisfying to the broader community and not satisfying to the individual. I grant the discontinuity. One thing I've pushed, when I as an individual hold an explanation, hold something to be true, for which I can have nothing but private evidence, I think I'm in a weaker position. At the end of the day, I need to find a group of people who share that belief so that I can find out if my own self-understanding is accurate. Think of Jack the Ripper, the famous criminal of 19th century, 19th, right? 19th century London.
Captured by technology, first radio message.
There we go. Even Jack the Ripper, at the end of the day, needs his club, his group, presumably of other criminals, where he can go and find out, assess his own actions. Jack believes that he's the greatest criminal of 19th century London. Is he really, he wonders? Am I just some second-rate criminal who thinks too much of himself? He needs to have other criminals to say, Jack, you're far and above, the best criminal around. He needs feedback. Likewise, the religious person needs feedback on the experience. Every religious tradition has some way where the great mystic can be assessed. The guru, the mystic, has ways to find out, and needs ways to find out whether she's deluded or has actually experienced ultimate reality in some way. That feedback process is what I've emphasized, and it moves broader and broader. You see, I start with other mystics, people like me, but then I want to know maybe I could convince others and others. That's why you find many Hindus, people who look at Vedic science, going to try to show that even when tested with the tools of modern science, these things stand up. Do you see? They're not satisfied just to remain within the narrow community. They want to see if this wisdom can show itself in the broader and broader ways of testing. And it's that movement outward I want you to recall when you think of this talk. That even the religious person shouldn't be satisfied just with the completely private, but at least has some interest on her own or his own part to look for these broader and broader contexts.